Welcome to Third Eye Weekly. Today we're speaking with Malcolm Gladwell, journalist and author of multiple New York Times bestsellers, including Tipping Point and Blink, both selling more than 2 million copies. Gladwell is here to speak with us about his book Outliers, which researches the underlying elements that allow individuals to thrive, such as their cultural upbringing and access to opportunity, and balance with technological timing. Surprisingly simple aspects of our lives, like what year we were born or the way we perceive power, impact the recipe for achievement in life. Thanks for joining us today, Malcolm.
Delighted to be here.
So I've read that you decided to write this book out of a frustration in how we as a society simplify what it means to be successful. Tell us a little bit about the story of that beginning of frustration for you.
Yeah, it struck me that this book was conceived at a moment when there was a real explosion of wealth and innovation and success, and particularly in the American economy, the Western economies. And I was frustrated with how people accounted for that wealth and power. That the stories they told were so focused on themselves, and the reasons they gave for how they've become successful were, they began and ended with the word "I," and that struck me as being a very inadequate and wrong way of explaining why people succeed. So I wanted to write a kind of corrective to that self-centered approach.
Your research is very extensive on reaching different cultures and demographics to pull out these underlying variables to success. Where did you venture first in this expedition to find and uncover these different factors?
Yeah, well, the first chapter that I wrote in the book was the chapter about Jewish lawyers, trying to understand how is it that a small minority in New York City, the descendant of very, very poor immigrants who were educated at lousy schools, who grew up in tenements in the Bronx, came to dominate the New York legal world within the span of 2 generations. And so that got me thinking a lot about culture and its and how culture shapes the way we're treated, our expectations, the decisions we make. So I sort of began really in sociology, and the thing that drew me into this was that the first problem with the individual-centric view of success is that it slights the contribution of culture, of the communities that we belong to, and how those communities fundamentally shape who we are and structure our opportunities. So I really began with that. In retrospect, I think that was a very fortuitous place to begin, because it's the cultural window on success is just sort of endlessly fascinating.
You mentioned, speaking of the culture, that you met with a lot of surprise when you realized how much that culture's power distance index played into things like the Korean air crashes up until '99. How did you feel when you realized that such tragedies could stem from these really subtle cultural differences?
Well, it was, it was a kind of, that was one of the most eye-opening chapters in the book, because like most of us, I had assumed that when you think about something like a plane crash, it has to do with something going wrong with the plane or some deficiency in decision-making by the pilot. I had a very kind of conventional view of what goes into an accident. And then it was an incredible surprise to understand that when you started to talk to people within the world of aviation, how their understanding of why a plane crash happens was totally different. The things they were talking about were how do pilots communicate in the cockpit, and more than that, how does the culture of the pilots in the cockpit affect the way they communicate? So they were asking questions, a totally different set of questions. And their notion of how plane crashes happened was they were coming at it from a perspective that had nothing to do with the plane itself. In their view, plane crashes happen because the pilots aren't being open and uninhibited in the way they discuss the problems of the plane. And so that question leads you to, well, why wouldn't they be open? what kinds of issues would affect the way they communicate, and that leads you straight to culture. And that, that was a kind of, like I said, I was so grateful to have started the book on the question of culture because it leads you in all these unexpected directions.
Yeah, it was unexpected to understand that English, adopting a new language like English, was a way that they could transform the power dynamic and become better communicators as pilots. I mean,
Yeah.
very fascinating.
Yeah, but more specifically than that, this idea that, the country that has one of the countries, the cultures in the world that has the lowest power distance, in other words, where people of different spots in the hierarchy feel freest to share their mind and speak freely and openly with each other, is Australia. And one of the things that that countries that are trying to build an airline do is they go and hire Australian pilots because they want to infect their own pilots with that same spirit of open communication. It's why if you're ever flying overseas in a South American or an Asian airline and you hear the pilot and he's Australian, that's why, right? There's a reason why they went and got an Australian guy. I mean, it's just sort of a kind of fascinating insight on how people tackle these kinds of problems.
So the issue of this cultural power dynamic is extensive throughout all airlines in the world. They know that this is an issue.
Oh, every airline in the world has thought about, trust me, by this point, has thought about the communication problem and how to solve it and how culture influences the way pilots talk to each other.
Interesting. In your writing, you do a really great job of creating a bridge between the world of academia and the general public. How do you go about walking that line?
Well, that's the hardest thing about the kinds of books that I write. That I'm trying to like I say, build a bridge between a highly specialized way of thinking about complicated issues, the way that academics approach them, and the general public, people who aren't expert in these fields. And the trick is you have to simplify in order to reach the general public, but you cannot simplify too much because then you lose the meaning of and the sophistication of the ideas. So walking that fine line, there's no perfect way to do it. I mean, and in every book, there are moments in the book where I think I've erred too far on the simplification side, and there are moments in every book where I think I've erred too far on the sophisticated side. It's just a trial and error process, and you try and be a little bit better than each time you write a book.
You've humbly admitted to seeing yourself outside of this group of outliers as just a journalist. Do you feel like you've met the 10,000 hours required to be a successful writer?
Well, I can't remember whether I made this point in the book or not, but 10,000 hours roughly translates to 10 years. It's 10 years of daily activity. I spent exactly 10 years at the Washington Post. And when I started at the Washington Post, I was just starting out as a journalist, and I was terrible. And I left after 10 years because I thought I had finally figured out what I was doing. So it's, in many ways, I responded to that theory because it seemed to play out so perfectly in my own career.
Absolutely. And what's your response to recent research that's attempting to refute the 10,000 hour theory?
Well, I've been following it. It doesn't refute it. What's happened is that people have pointed out instances where it doesn't apply. So it doesn't apply to sports. And I don't think anyone involved with this theory has ever claimed that it did, except people who want to misuse it. So you don't have to do 10,000 hours of practice to be a great running back in the National Football League. But also, what's also more interesting is to look for variations. So are there people who, either because of the way they practice and learn, or because some element of their own ability, can do it in less than 10,000 hours? And if so, what is special about those people? That's where the research, I think, is headed now, and that's really fascinating, because suppose we were to find someone who could become an international grandmaster in chess after only 7,000 hours of practice in chess. What if there was something they were doing that allowed them to learn so much more efficiently than the rest of us? That would be really interesting. So this kind of, the 10,000 hour principle is an average, but it shouldn't stop us from learning from those at either end of the bell curve, right? Looking at those who take longer than that and helping them approach the average, and looking at those who do it in a shorter time and learning from them.
So Outliers makes a case for saying that the world has a great impact on who you can and can't be, and it's not solely up to the individual. So how do we go about providing opportunities at the world level for more outliers in the future?
Yeah. Well, that's the kind of challenge that I leave readers with at the end of the book, is that once you understand how much success is not an individual act, but a group activity, the clear implication is that gives the rest of us and societies an obligation to figure out ways to productively help people. It says you can't walk away from your responsibilities or from your obligations to others. There's a line in the book where I say that that understanding the true nature of success should make us less in awe of those who succeed and less willing to judge those who fail. And that's also part of it. It ought to shape our attitude towards those who haven't made it. And, we should spend a little less time patting the winners on the back and a little bit more time trying to ask the question, why do so many people not fulfill their potential? And what's the best way for us to kind of assist them in getting to the point where they can make the most of themselves?
Excellent. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Malcolm, thanks so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure.
Real delight. Thanks, guys.
Take care.
Take care.